Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise tonight to present my thoughts on Bill C-57. I regret very much that we are in a time allocation situation on this bill, and even more so do I regret the hour that it's now approaching 11 p.m. And this legislation, which is important, deserves to be heard in normal fashion with full debate. Let me go back to when this bill originated. The Federal Sustainable Development Act was actually passed in the era of the Conservative government and was one of those rare pieces of legislation that originated with the opposition. This bill was brought forward by a former Liberal MP named John Godfrey. It was one of his last contributions as a very diligent and thoughtful member of Parliament. He went on to leave Parliament and become back to his old stomping grounds of education. But sustainable development and aspects of sustainable development had been in Canadian law before. This bill managed to get through Parliament in 2008. And the successor bill we have before us tonight does improve on some elements of sustainable development, as was originally put forward through a lot of cooperation in this place back in 2008. I wasn't yet a member of Parliament in that year, but I followed very closely the development of the Sustainable Development Act because it was really a high watermark for the minority government years of former Prime Minister Harper, because opposition parties were willing to work together. They had the majority, of course. The opposition parties had the majority, but very rarely used it. And in this case, the Sustainable Development Act was brought in. This act could have been improved, could have been stronger, but there's very little that I would say is wrong with it. I'm disappointed that we've repealed the definition of the precautionary principle, but overall, the bill does provide for strengthening for the application of sustainable development principles to more parts of the federal government. And I do like the creation of the Sustainable Development Advisory Council. Now, one of the reasons I think it has real potential, but I don't think the government plans to do with it what I hope they will do. Going back to the early 1960s and for decades, the Canadian government benefited from well-researched, strong public policy advice from institutions that we no longer have. We used to have, starting in 1963, we had the Economic Council of Canada. We had as well the Science Council of Canada. In the early 70s, we had the creation of the Canadian Environmental Advisory Council. Now, in the early 90s, in fact, in 1993, all three of those agencies were wound up and repealed. So that means we lost the Economic Council of Canada, the Science Council of Canada, the Canadian Environmental Advisory Council. Why were they wound up and repealed? Well, in 1993, the federal government brought in the National Round Table on Environment and Economy. This was our first substantial sustainable development tool with the idea, to quote the late Jim McNeill, brilliant Canadian diplomat and former deputy minister who really championed the ideas of sustainable development. One of the core ideas, to quote Jim McNeill, was if we change the way we make decisions, we'll change the kind of decisions we make. So the idea of the National Roundtable was that by bringing together people from different perspectives, trade unions, large corporate enterprises, academics, environmentalists, Indigenous people, as well as government ministers and agencies and so on, that the kind of give and take and shared learning would create decisions that met the challenge of sustainability. Because sustainability is not environment by itself. Sustainability has at least three legs to the stool: environment, social, and economic concerns, but within a very clear mandate to ensure that the decisions we take today do not compromise the ability of future generations to make their own decisions, to meet their own needs. In other words, sustainability requires that we think about intergenerational equity. Well, back in 1993, when they eliminated the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy, with the goal of sustainability. And that, I have to say, over the years, although I confess I was also a member of the National Roundtable, I was vice chair for quite a while, but the work was substantial. So I'm not blowing my own horn. It was a lot of work by a lot of people over many years, and I served only for a relatively brief period. But in 2012, under Omnibus Budget Bill C-38, the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy was eliminated. Now, no one at that point said, oh boy, we better bring back all those other advisory bodies that we eliminated when we created the National Roundtable. So there's no longer the Economic Council, no longer the Science Council, no longer the Canadian Environmental Advisory Council, and there's no National Roundtable. So this is the first time that something has been created that could meet that need, and this is described as the Sustainable Development Advisory Council. It's pretty thin gruel. It could do a lot. The Treasury Board within this act could establish policies or issue directives, could be funding adequately this new agency, which is quite modestly proposed in this act. But I certainly hope the government will realize that we are desperately in need of sound advice on what is sustainable and what is not. Speaking of what is not sustainable is today's announcement that the Government of Canada is going to form a Crown Corporation, that Crown Corporation will now be the management entity for a pipeline that the federal government proposes to buy with a closing date in August. I have to say, I can only hope that something goes wrong with this sale, because this is monstrous. We're proposing to spend $4.5 billion to buy the assets of what used to be called, well, it's still called the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but owned by Kinder Morgan of Houston, Texas. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, by the way, was built in 1953 by a Canadian company with the goal of bringing crude or synthetic crude to Burnaby, British Columbia, where over time they developed 4 refineries. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline was all about bringing Canadian crude from Alberta to Canadian refineries in the Lower Mainland for domestic use. When Kinder Morgan bought the assets of Trans Mountain, which are now more than 60 years old, in its valuation to the National Energy Board, Kinder Morgan put the value of the Trans Mountain assets at $550 million. Those are the assets that today the Minister of Finance announced we would buy at a price of $4.5 billion. That's astonishing. Kinder Morgan has certainly achieved a very rich return on investment without having invested new infrastructure. Kinder Morgan wanted to build a new pipeline, as we know, but I think they'd lost interest. That's why they kidnapped their own project, said that if we didn't have a solution by May 31st, they'd walk away. Clearly for political reasons, primarily for the impact in Alberta, the federal government decided anything was preferable to having Kinder Morgan walk away. So they've done something astonishing. Spend $4.5 billion to buy the existing assets of the old pipeline and take on, as yet undescribed by the Minister of Finance, but Kinder Morgan said it would be a $7.4 billion project to build the expansion, a project that has not yet cleared its conditions with the National Energy Board, is still before the courts in 15 different court cases for violation of Indigenous rights, for a completely scandalously inadequate environmental review before the National Energy Board, within which evidence was put forward by Kinder Morgan and no interveners were allowed to cross-examine. So we now find ourselves asking, does this government understand sustainable development? Because overarching all of this is the most fundamental and pressing question: what about the climate crisis? How can we possibly claim that Canada understands the pressing imperative of the transition off fossil fuels, whether in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, the date needs to be picked, we need to make plans? How can you understand the imperative of avoiding the kind of disaster that deprives not hypothetical future generations, but our own children alive in front of us today that we tuck in at night? How can we possibly think we understand sustainability while building pipelines? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her speech. She quite rightly referred to the fact that the original Sustainable Development Act was actually a collaboration within this very House, but in a previous Parliament. It was a minority government, and it actually produced an act that all members in this House could support, that reflected the appropriate balance between our social objectives, our environmental objectives, and our economic imperatives. And then that went on to result in a study that took place at the Environment Committee. We studied the Act as it had been implemented over a number of years. We found a number of shortcomings. We suggested improvements. Some of those improvements were actually incorporated into the bill we have before us called Bill C-57. However, at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. If a government doesn't want to apply the lens of sustainability, it won't. And quite frankly, I have serious reservations about the ability of this Liberal government to actually understand what sustainability means. And my colleague actually referenced that. She asked the question, does this government actually understand sustainability? And she referred to the Kinder Morgan sale, the purchase by the government of that pipeline, as being a clear indicator of how this government does not understand sustainability. But I would ask her, does she have any other examples of where this government is failing to understand the true notion of sustainability?
The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to my friend from Abbotsford, and certainly there are many. As a matter of fact, every time I hear the minister say that the environment and the economy go hand in hand, increasingly I have that image of Thelma and Louise just at the last frame of the film. Because environment and economy go hand in hand when you choose to do things for the economy that benefit the environment. But when you choose to do things that are in conflict, then you're living in a world of trying to hold opposing notions together at the same time, otherwise known as cognitive dissonance. So for specific examples, approving 2 LNG projects that drive up greenhouse gases in BC, Petronas LNG and Woodfibre LNG, approving Site C, a project that did not receive an environmental assessment clean bill of health, where if they'd gone back and looked at that review, they would not have approved it. There have been numerous occasions where the decision-making goes against what I had expected from a government that claims to understand sustainability. I do applaud the effort to put in place a carbon price, but they've not removed fossil fuel subsidies, and as anyone can see, spending billions of dollars, at least at this point they're committed to at least $15 billion on this project, is the opposite of ending fossil fuel subsidies. It's inventing new ones.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? Questions and comments? Oh, the honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, again for an opportunity to ask a follow-up question. She mentioned intergenerational equity. This is something that now that has been incorporated into sustainability. And I would ask her to perhaps expand on what that means to her and how that will benefit future generations of Canadians.
The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Highlands has about a minute, just a little over a minute to respond.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my friend from Abbotsford for the question. The essence of sustainability in many ways goes back to the concept that comes to us from the Iroquois Confederacy of making decisions unto the 7th generation, so that when you think about what you're doing, and today we're thinking long term. Now, our economic theories tend to discount the future, and it's hard for us to think about what it means to future generations because they're not right here in front of us. At a minimum, and this goes back to the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, the idea was that decisions we make today should meet our own needs while at the same time ensuring that we don't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So the kinds of things that exemplify sustainability, for instance, are projects that ensure we are replanting as many trees as possible, ensuring, for instance, that we might do everything we can to suck carbon out of the atmosphere by replanting the mangrove forests of the planet. That we've removed about a third of the mangrove forests. We're doing everything we can to get fossil fuels out of our electricity system. Decarbonizing electricity is a key goal, and one of the things we could do if we're throwing around $4.5 billion is use it to build an east-west electricity grid to green up our electricity sector. Thank you.